So Rod has already mentioned today how I was going to be speaking about service, and we've talked a little bit throughout the songs about service and what that looks like. Today I want to start out with a question. What is the first thing that you think about when you think about service? Maybe you think about military service, or maybe you think about things like room service or fine dining, being waited on at a fancy table, right? Maybe you think about things like mission trips or serving somewhere else in the church. The man that Jess mentioned, the architect, thought of his service as building a church, right? Now, we've been talking about the spiritual disciplines for the last several weeks, and so far we talked about things like prayer and meditation and fasting that are probably things you would recognize as spiritual disciplines before we ever even started this series. Those are things that you have at least heard of before in this context, and you've probably tried to put those things into practice before in your lives. But service may be one of those things that you have never thought about as a spiritual discipline before. A couple of weeks ago, we defined the spiritual disciplines as things that help us get closer to God by bringing us before Him so that we can be changed by Him. And if we're going by that definition, then serving fits right into that definition with the rest of the disciplines. The disciplines that we've talked about so far are what we would talk about as inward disciplines. They're ones that are mostly between us and God. They're pretty private things that help us grow to be more like Jesus, but they're things that other people can't readily see unless they know you really well. You can't just tell by looking at someone if they've been reading scripture faithfully, if they've been praying constantly, or even if they've been fasting. In fact, one of the things that Rod mentioned last week is that Jesus told us to keep things like fasting private, because if we do it for the praise of other people, then that is the only reward we will get from it. Those disciplines help us to help the Holy Spirit do His work of developing the fruit of the Spirit in us, but they aren't very visible. Service is pretty different. Service is an outward discipline because it serves the same function as the other disciplines to bring us closer to God, but service is a very visible thing. Service is one of the things that we call the outward disciplines because it's something people can see you doing. It's something that you do for other people, and it's evident that you are practicing service because you show it through your actions. The discipline of service is a lifestyle of serving other people, a mindset of being focused on other people in whatever you do so you can meet the needs of other people. Many people like to have their lives focused only on themselves. In the Bible, we see Solomon do that. He focused only on himself. He did whatever he wanted to do, and whatever desire happened across his mind that day, he did it, and he had the means to do it as well as king. Listen to how he says that went for him. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 10, it says, "Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept from my heart no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. And then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil that I had expended in doing it, and behold, it was all vanity, and was a striving after the wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. And so I hated life, because whatever is done under the sun was grievous to me, and for all is vanity and a striving after the wind." So if we take our cue from Solomon, and if we are focusing on ourselves in how we live our lives, if we play our cards right, we might make a lot of money, we might be powerful in the eyes of the world, but focusing on ourselves and our own desires will only bring temporary happiness and satisfaction. It will never last, and it will never compare to the eternal life that awaits us if we live our lives in service to God and to other people. Service is all about submitting to God's agenda instead of to ours, and focusing more on other people than we do on ourselves. Living a life of service means that we take on the status of a servant instead of just doing acts of service every once in a while. I want you to see the difference in that because it's a pretty important distinction, and I want to challenge the way that you think about service in this way. Anyone can go and do a specific act of service every once in a while, like serving in a soup kitchen, or going on a mission trip every once in a while, or helping serve a meal, or any number of other things. But that doesn't mean that they're living their life as a servant. Serving like that is kind of like being a Sunday Christian. Some people will come to church on Sunday, they'll put on a nice mask while they're here, and then come Monday morning, they can forget all about their faith for a week and go back to life as normal. And when we treat our faith like that way, we really aren't following Jesus. And when we treat service like that, we are only putting on a good show for a little while before we can go back to serving ourselves instead. It makes service just a list of things that we do. It means that we are still in control, and that we aren't really being a servant. Having a true servant's heart and allowing yourself to take on the status of a servant means that you live totally focused on serving Jesus and on serving other people. It means that you give your life totally over to Jesus' control and let him be the Lord of your life. A life devoted to Christ is a life lived for Jesus no matter what day it is. A life that is seeking to get close to God just as much Monday through Saturday as it is on Sunday morning. And that's what a true life of service looks like as well. It means constantly being on the lookout for ways to serve other people between those big opportunities that we have. Instead of only serving when there's announcement that there is service needed, a true servant looks for opportunities all the time. Instead of only serving inside the walls of a church, a person who lives a life of service will be serving others where they meet people in their everyday life, Monday through Saturday. It takes service away from just being a list of things that we do and makes it a lifestyle. And that's what Jesus did. He didn't just come here to serve every once in a while. He didn't come to check off a to-do list. He came here to be a servant himself. Now we see service in several places throughout the Bible, but the two I want to highlight today are in Paul and of course in Jesus. Paul considered himself a servant of Jesus and not just a worker for the sake of the gospel, not just an apostle. Paul identified himself as a servant. In Philippians chapter 1 says, this is how he introduces his letter. Paul and Timothy, servants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi with the overseers and the deacons. In Titus chapter 1, he does the same thing. Paul, a servant of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ, for the sake of the faith of God's elect and their knowledge of the truth which accords with godliness. Now, we tend to tone down what Paul said here, but Paul uses the word in Greek that is the Greek word doulos, which is not just the word for servant, it is the word for slave. That term didn't speak of a person who worked for pay or who was an employee of someone as we think of servants today. This spoke of someone who was owned by another person, someone who had a master to obey, not just a servant, but a slave. Now, a slave had no say over what he did, over what tasks that they did, over who they get to serve and where they get to serve. They only serve at the beck and call of their master. And that's how Paul saw himself, a slave or servant of Jesus Christ. And if we're serious about service, if we're serious about practicing this discipline in our lives, that's how we'll begin to see ourselves as well. Now, why would we want to do that? Why would we want to put ourselves under the rule of someone else like that? To us, slavery and servitude is a pretty repulsive thing most of the time. So why would we want that? Well, the short answer is that we make ourselves servants because Jesus made himself a servant. The whole point of practicing the spiritual disciplines is to be more like Jesus, to get closer to him. Now, involuntary servitude and slavery is cruel and dehumanizing. But when we freely choose to be a servant, it changes everything. Voluntary service is a joy, not an oppression. Jesus is our greatest example of that. He stepped down not just to do acts of service, but into the very position and status of a servant, of a slave. In Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, and Paul uses the same word here that he used of himself, doulos, the word that means slave. It says, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." Paul ties Jesus' humility in with him being a servant because service is one of the best ways that we can gain humility in our lives. Humility is one of the things that we can't really get at by going straight for it. If your goal is to be humble, one of the best ways to accomplish that is to serve other people. Work for the good of other people and not for yourself. Now, when we do something for the good of others and we don't seek the recognition or the reward for it, when our motive is solely for the sake of the other person, it changes something inside our spirits. Serving others plants a seed of humility in us. Every time our human nature cries out that we want attention for that good deed that we just did, and then we quiet our human nature and allow that deed to remain hidden and out of sight, then we are disciplining our flesh and we are transforming our desires. Paul calls this crucifying the flesh with its passions and its desires in Galatians chapter 5. Practicing the discipline of service to other people in our life is one of the best ways to do that. If we let ourselves be driven by our flesh and by our desires and our passions, then we become slaves to those things. We practice the spiritual disciplines to keep our sinful human nature in check and keep our focus on Jesus, where our focus needs to be. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 that no one can serve two masters. Now, the immediate context of what he said there was about money, but it holds true for any passion or desire that is not of God. If we are slaves to our old sinful desires, then we are under their control. That means we are taking control away from the one who should be the Lord of our lives. Now, Jesus calls us to service by being a servant himself, by acting as a servant himself. In John chapter 13, we see one of the best examples of this. It says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God, and he was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. And then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, to wipe them down with a towel that was wrapped around him. Now, did you catch the first thing that John said there? We usually focus on what Jesus did for the disciples. But at the beginning of that, he said Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. Jesus knew his position. Jesus knew his status. He knew his authority. Most of us in his situation wouldn't be caught dead doing something like washing other people's feet. That was a task reserved for the lowest of servants. And yet Jesus, although he knew exactly who he was and where he was headed, he put himself in that position of a servant willingly. None of the disciples were willing to put themselves in the position of a servant, but Jesus did. And he is our example of how we ought to serve others as well. That all sounds great. It's easy to talk about service, but truly acting as a servant is a lot more difficult than it sounds. Truly putting that into practice in our lives can be a very difficult thing. There are a lot of things that keep us from practicing service properly or even at all sometimes. The first thing that keeps us from doing that is pride. Pride is exactly what the disciples were struggling with at the Last Supper. They didn't want to be put in this position of a servant, and neither do we most of the time. We don't have to be the greatest, right? But we certainly don't want to be last place. We don't have to be Michael Jordan, but we also don't want to be on the bench, right? If you watch a group of people for any length of time, you'll realize that people can't be together in a group for very long before some sort of pecking order is established. Someone comes out on top. You quickly find out who's in charge and who's going to take over. And sometimes it's not who you expect. When my sister and I were young, we went and picked out a couple of puppies from a litter of barn dogs that had just been weaned. And my sister picked out this bigger dog who was happy and playing around and was just a kind of well-natured little dog. I picked out the runt of the litter who walked over to me and started to pull on my shoelaces with her teeth. And that should have been my first clue as to how she was going to turn out. My dog was always the smaller one, but she was the one with the attitude. Whenever we would feed them, the bigger, stronger dog would come and she would tentatively take a mouthful of food, and then she would run for the other side of the yard because her little sister was growling at her, keeping her out of the house. There was a pecking order established from day one, and that little dog with the attitude was the one who was the one in charge. But see, Jesus did away with that kind of order based on dominance and based on status. And it wasn't just a reversal of that order either, as if now the low man on the totem pole becomes the one in charge. On high school mission trips, we would all line up for dinner, and to illustrate that idea of the first becomes last, our youth minister would say, okay, now the end of the line goes around and goes in first, because everybody wanted to get in to dinner first, and he tried to illustrate that point. Well, that's a reversal, right? That's the last are at the very beginning of the line now. They're the ones that go first. Jesus did something different. Excuse me. In Matthew chapter 20, it says, Jesus called to him and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, Jesus was not doing away with leadership. He was just doing away with the pride that so often goes with it. The authority that Jesus talked about was solely about function and status, or function but not status. Remember, we said that service grows humility in our lives. And the result of that humility is we no longer care about status. We care about the people themselves. This is not just leadership, this is servant leadership. Leading through acting as a servant, like Jesus did. Now, another thing that hinders us from practicing service the way we should is doing service to be recognized for it. If we are doing service as a spiritual discipline, there is no glory in it. We are doing it solely to become more like Jesus and to serve other people. True service has to be distinguished from self-righteous service. Self-righteous service is drawn toward the big service, the places they can get the most recognition. True service is drawn toward the smaller tasks, the more mundane. And true servants see those things as the more important ones. Self-righteous service needs external rewards. They need to know that someone sees what they do and they appreciate their effort. They seek recognition by human beings with a kind of false modesty that we probably all have seen before. But true service is not done for recognition. It is content to be behind the scenes, never noticed, never recognized, and recognition from God is all that they seek. Self-righteous service is concerned with the results, whether or not the person they served will reciprocate. They tend to get burned out if they never get served in return, and they are always concerned with getting taken advantage of. Whatever happens what happens is they end up only serving those who will serve them in return and recognize them in the way that they want to be recognized. But true service doesn't care about what happens afterwards. True servants are only there to serve anyway. And so it doesn't matter who they serve. It doesn't matter what jobs they do. It can be their enemy as well as their friend, and they will still gladly serve them. But because true service is about serving wherever God calls, whoever God calls, and whenever God calls. It's not about doing what we want to do because we want to do it. They don't care if they are taken advantage of because they just care about the people that they are serving. Self-righteous service picks and chooses who to serve or where to serve based on the result that they want. They might serve the poor and the humble if it will earn them the reputation that they want to have. But at the same time, they might avoid serving certain types of people if that might give them a bad reputation with people. True service is indiscriminate. Doesn't care what the person is like, what the reputation is like, because they are only there because they care and they can meet a need. True service is just like Jesus. He ate with the outcasts of his culture, the prostitutes and the tax collectors, because they were the ones who needed him the most. Self-righteous service is temporary. Those people serve for a while the acts of service they want to do are being done, but if something comes up that they find distasteful, it will be nowhere to be seen. But true service is not done for a while and then stops. True service is a lifestyle. Another thing that sometimes keeps us from serving is thinking that service has to be planned out. It has to be this big, elaborate thing, or that it's going to take a whole lot of work to get it done. A few years ago, a bunch of churches in Lincoln, Illinois, started a program called Together for Lincoln. And they joined together to do service projects throughout the community all day long, had thousands of people involved, and helped thousands of people in the process. And it's a really awesome event where a lot of service happens. They did things like build wheelchair ramps, make sure smoke detectors were working, do projects around people's houses that they couldn't get done. But it takes a lot of coordination. It takes a lot of planning, and they are gearing up for the next year as soon as the event ends this year. But here's the thing, that kind of service is great, but service doesn't have to be like that. True service that we are talking about comes when we are listening to the voice of God and he prompts us to go and serve someone else. It doesn't have to be planned out. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. And I was very blessed because I grew up in a home with two really good examples of that in both of my parents. My dad was always doing things like taking carts in for people after they had loaded their groceries, or paying for someone's dinner at a restaurant and leaving before they found out who it was, or taking care of a maintenance issue that older folks in our church had in their house and he could take care of. My mom is one of those people who does service behind the scenes. She sees a need and she just kind of quietly goes to work. I can't tell you how many times she has been at our house and I'll go in later and find something she did I didn't even know about until after she left. A sink full of dishes has been washed, or a basket full of laundry has been folded. One day when we were renting an apartment in Lincoln, Beth and I woke up to come downstairs, and my mom was making breakfast and cleaning our kitchen, and my dad was fixing the bathroom fan in our bathroom downstairs. See, that's practicing service. When there is a need that you can meet and you can do it with no expectation of a reward. A lot of times we don't serve, or we get burnt out on serving because we feel like Rod mentioned before, that our service doesn't matter. One day we were talking about service in Sunday school class when we were a part of a church in Mount Pulaski. And the minister said he thought the biggest problem with serving in the church is that we make one task more important than another. He said that he considered one of the most important services in the entire church the guy that came in and made coffee before Sunday school every Sunday morning. And we have people that do that here too. We have people that come in and make communion so that it's ready for Sunday morning. We have people that come and make coffee. We have people that come and do all kinds of things that seem like small little tasks, and you don't notice them until they don't get done. We had a few weeks ago where some wires got crossed, somebody didn't know they were supposed to do communion, and we didn't have communion ready. And man, we were scrambling right before communion happened. But when we do those little acts of service, nobody may notice, but those are so, so important. That minister at Mount Pulaski said he thought it was one of the most important things that happened in the church because the coffee time that they had in the kitchen right before classes started was the time when people connected. And when that person didn't come in and make coffee, those connections didn't happen. Those kinds of relationships didn't get formed, and it actually ended up being one of the most important things about that church. So even if you think that your service is insignificant and it doesn't matter, it does. Our enemy wants nothing more than to convince us that the things that we do are not good enough. And sometimes that keeps us from serving at all. But if we can get past that lie and realize that no matter what we do, our service is important, and every act of service is important, then we can start to do those little things and realize that they are things that really matter in the life of the church. Now, sometimes we have no desire to serve at all. Changing our attitude and developing a servant's heart really takes a lot of time. Living a life of service comes from an overflow of God in your life. And if you are just starting out in your faith, or maybe your faith has been kind of stagnant and you haven't grown in a while, you might not feel like living out a life of service. Now, if that's where you're at, instead of trying to pursue a life of service, instead try to pursue a life that is filled to the brim with Jesus. Because as you get closer to Jesus and you become more like him, you will become more like Jesus in the way that you serve as well. The author Gary Smalley says he looks at it like this: every day when he wakes up, he takes his empty cup of the day and he goes to meet with Jesus to fill it up. And then during the day, he empties that cup serving other people. And the next day, he goes again to meet with Jesus to fill it up so he can do it all over again. One of the things that Gary Johnson said when he was here is we don't do all the things we do for other people out of our own strength. We go to Jesus to get from him what we need for everybody else. And that's what Gary Smalley is talking about too. So how do we get started with a lifestyle of service? A lot of people get hung up because they just don't know what to do. And I'd like to give you some practical suggestions. So first, take a good look at where you are right now and start there. Use the gifts and talents that God has given you to serve other people. If you're good at working on cars, then look for people who would be blessed by an oil change or a tire rotation. If you're good at carpentry, offer up your skills to those who might need a few things done around the house. If you're a talented cook, look for the times where you can cook a meal or a loaf of bread for someone and take it over to their house, like after the loss of a loved one or when their family is sick. Maybe you can wash someone's car or give someone a ride who doesn't have a car. Maybe you're really good at sitting and talking with folks, and you can go sit with folks in a nursing home or folks that don't get out of their house very often and kind of curb some of the loneliness that they're feeling. If you have the ability to help financially, then look for someone in the grocery store that you can bless by paying for their groceries that day. God gives us gifts and talents so that we can serve other people. It's up to us to use them well. One of the most important things that we can do is pray about opportunities to serve. Pray that God would lead you to an opportunity where you can use your gifts and talents. A large part of practicing the disciplines in your life is listening to God and serving where he tells you to serve. in a certain serve a certain person or in a certain area. A part of our prayer also needs to be asking God to give us the humility and also the boldness to respond when he calls us to serve. And my final suggestion is something that I really struggle with a lot as well. Sometimes you have to let other people serve you as well. This isn't so much about practicing the discipline of serving in your life, but allowing other people to do it in theirs. Now, many times we're okay serving, we're okay being behind the scenes, not being recognized for things, but then when we need help with something, we don't want to ask for help. We would tell other people they shouldn't be afraid to ask us for help, but then we won't do it ourselves, no matter how difficult the task is, no matter how much we're struggling. To ask for help is a sign of weakness, right, men? It seems to be an issue men struggle with more than women, right? For some, the truth of it is that not allowing other people to serve you is just another form of pride. We need the humility to serve others without calling attention to ourselves. We also need the humility to allow others to serve when we need help as well. And that's what the church is all about, using our gifts and our abilities to serve one another and to build each other up. Now, I knew that was the case, but I still often refuse to ask for help. My wife gently, or sometimes not so gently, let me know that. What started me down the road of this kind of humility, which I'm still going down, is when I realized that refusing to let someone else serve you robs them of the opportunity to grow, to become more like Jesus. When we don't let others serve us, we are letting our pride get in the way of that person practicing the spiritual discipline of service. Now, in order to live a life of true service, we have to get ourselves and our pride out of the way. We have to have the humility of the servant at all times, like Jesus did. And as we get closer to him and we allow ourselves to be filled up by him, then we will find ourselves living more and more as true servants of Jesus.